Hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Autoimmune Holistic Nutrition Masterclass. My name is Tim. I'm the Director of Academic Communications here at AFPA, and I'm so glad all of you could join us again today. And I'm super excited to have our two guest presenters here today, Dr. Laura Zakaria and Laura Adler. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us. So glad to have you here. We are going to give everyone about 2 to 3 minutes to come in and get settled. So yesterday, before we got started, we asked folks what motivated them to sign up for this training, and hundreds of people responded with a number of different reasons. But the most common reason that I saw was that either many of you were either diagnosed with an autoimmune disease yourselves, or you knew someone who has struggled with autoimmunity. So today, if you feel comfortable sharing, I'd like to invite you to share with us in the chat box before we get started what you personally feel is most challenging about autoimmune disease, and we'll take a look at your responses in just a minute. So yesterday we heard from Dr. Deanna Minnick about the various root causes of autoimmune disease. We talked about some of the micro and macronutrients and some of the phytonutrients that are important to consider with autoimmunity. She also talked about some of the environmental influences of autoimmunity and some of the different things to consider when working with your clients. And we also learned about some specific things to think about when it comes to tailoring your recommendations and how to decide the best strategies for your clients from Ebony Williams. And today, both Dr. Zakaria and Laura are going to be taking a deeper dive into all of those topics. So if you didn't get a chance to join us yesterday, you're not only going to get a concise recap of what was discussed, most likely, but you're also going to get an even deeper dive into some of those topics. So we'll be getting started with our introductions very shortly, but I do just want to take a minute and read some of your responses to see what all of you consider to be the most challenging part of autoimmune disease. Kathy said most challenging about autoimmune would be how flare-ups happen too long after the trigger, making it difficult to figure out what caused the flare. Absolutely, how to manage all of your symptoms. Laura and Dr. Zakaria, anything standing out to you that you'd like to comment on or respond to here?
I'm seeing a lot of gut issues as being an issue, a part of it. And then a lot of people I think, struggle with the nutrition and lifestyle facet of like, how do you modify that? I've seen a couple of people comment to that, which is interesting.
I saw a couple of people say, feeling you look normal and sort of being dismissed. I also saw somebody write doctors, and I'm assuming you mean, and correct me if I'm wrong in the chat, but I'm assuming you mean sort of getting the runaround, or maybe even like the length of time it takes to get diagnosed with an autoimmune disease, or also maybe being dismissed. Obviously, I second what Laura is saying about the that lifestyle piece, and maybe some of the confusing, conflicting information that's out there, and maybe could also feel overwhelming. Yeah,
absolutely. That's all really important. And some of this, I think both of you will be touching on today, just in terms of, some of the different strategies and, how to use nutrition and lifestyle to make people feel better. So that's great. Thank you so much, everyone, for sharing. Let's go ahead and get started with just a few different notes and reminders. So firstly, grab your notepad or open up your note-taking app, because I'm sure there are going to be a lot of gems and a lot of information that you'll likely want to refer back to or reference later. Both Laura and Dr. Zakaria do a particularly great job at sharing practical information that you can apply as you work with your clients. So I'd highly recommend being prepared to take notes. Also, if you need to enlarge the window and want to see the slides a little bit larger, there should be an icon on your screen on the top right if you're on a desktop. I'm not sure where it is on mobile, but there's 2 arrows, and that will enlarge the presentation if you'd like to see it a little bit bigger. Also, there will be a replay available after today's session. It will be automatically delivered into your email a couple hours after we conclude tonight. And we'll also have a transcription and a closed captioned option of this video if you need that by the end of the week. If you experience any connection problems with the audio or video, the first thing I'd recommend is try refreshing your page. If that doesn't resolve it, try to log out and then back in. And as a last resort, you can try another web browser. If for whatever reason you just have a bad connection, you will absolutely have access to the replays and you can catch up when it's convenient for you. We will try to save some time at the end for Q&A, so just feel free to ask your questions as we progress. And if we have time at the end, we'll do our best to answer all of your questions. So how today's session is going to work, we're going to get started in just a second with introductions. We've already done our pre-start poll, and then we'll get started with Dr. Zakaria's presentation. We'll ask a follow-up question if we have time, and then we'll do the same for Laura's presentation, and at the end we will have our Q&A depending on the time. So let's go ahead and get started with Dr. Zakaria. Could you tell us just a little bit about yourself, your background, and a little bit about what you're going to be talking about today?
Well, first of all, it is my pleasure to be here tonight, and I'm very excited to talk to all of you. It sounds like you guys are really primed and ready to really have this deep conversation about autoimmune disease. And what I'd like to get into a little bit today are the dietary factors and maybe some of the diet trends you may have seen, so that you recognize them and understand maybe why some people might be attracted to them, why we are seeing sort of a trend towards moving into those kind of like book pulled together types of diets, right? And we'll talk about what that means. But what I actually really want you to walk away with is an understanding of what's happening under the hood and how you could start to pull together what we call the functional medicine lens on autoimmune disease. And it starts to explain why maybe in the conventional space, it's a little bit harder to put our finger on it, and why some folks were saying in the chat that they're getting that runaround. I am seeing quite a few people say that the audio isn't great, or you're hearing some echo. Is anybody here good audio? That'll help us figure out, is anybody hearing good audio right now? Yes, so there's a few people, and maybe Tim, you can help folks who are having trouble with the audio. Awesome. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Dr. Lara Zakaria. I am a functional medicine trained pharmacist, as well as a CNS certified nutrition specialist, nutritionist. Has anybody, I'm sure most of you have heard of pharmacists, so I'm going to skip that question, but has anybody here heard of or not heard of functional medicine? Is that a new term for folks? And I'll let you chat it up for me in the chat box. No, haven't heard it. No, okay, and we're going to get into it. A couple of you have, okay, fantastic. I'm going to get into that. So when we talk about functional medicine, we're talking about a framework and a way that we use our training, whether it be nutrition, pharmacy, personal training, doctors, whatever you're in the space in terms of self-serving and helping and healing people. The functional lens is the lens that you put on top of it so that you can filter through, so that you can connect all the moving pieces and understand how things function collectively together, and how you could then use lifestyle modification, diet, and sometimes medication, sometimes it's acupuncture, sometimes you're referring to things like massage therapy, or all these adjunctive therapies, so that they work together in synergy to address the underlying piece that's causing that problem. So you'll hear us a lot of times, obviously, talk about diet, we'll talk about lifestyle modification, we'll talk about exercise, we'll talk about stress management, sleep, toxic exposure, infections, traumas, etc. And the idea is that everybody's got a unique set of exposures over the course of their lifetime that layer on top of their genetics, layer on top of their daily habits, and that predisposes them to certain chronic diseases and certain illnesses. And so our job as functional medicine practitioners is to try to get under the hood and figure out what exactly is that combination that's creating illness for somebody. And no two people look exactly alike, but generally we can start to pull together these constellations so we can understand them better. So that's what I do. That's what I do every day, and I try to teach folks on how to use this lens to look at chronic disease a different way towards the end of trying to help get people healthier, and hopefully to get people to reverse or even prevent chronic disease. That's even better if we can get folks prevented. So, all right, can you guys see my screen? Can you tell me in the chat? Awesome. All right, so.
See your screen. I was going to have the other Laura introduce herself first before we go into your presentation, but we'll leave your screen here. And Laura, if you just want to quickly introduce yourself, we'll go ahead and jump right in.
Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Laura Adler. I'm an environmental toxins expert and educator. I have spent the last decade educating wellness professionals, health professionals, really across all modalities about the links between chronic low-level environmental chemical exposures and chronic health issues that we're all experiencing. And so that's really what we're going to be talking about in my presentation. My focus is not from a clinical perspective, but rather from a practical perspective of where are we being exposed to these toxicants, how might they be affecting us, and then what can we do both individually for ourselves, and then also where we engage with our clients or patients on supporting them in working towards reducing exposures in meaningful ways in all the places that are possible and accessible to us. So I'll be diving into that on my side of the presentation.
You know.
Is really going to help us to kind of fill in some of the puzzles as we go through, since I'm only really going to be focusing on the dietary piece. All right, so let's dive into it. So as I sort of alluded to before, when we're looking at autoimmunity from the functional medicine perspective, in the more conventional space, we're looking at what's over here on the right side of the screen. It's symptom-based approach, meaning that when you see a symptom of an autoimmune disease, that is what you are going to try to address. So if somebody is having pain as a symptom, we're going to give them something for pain. If somebody is having thyroid issues as a symptom, we're going to give them something for thyroid. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't address the symptom. You absolutely should address the symptom. But unfortunately, that's often where conventional medicine stops. It only addresses the symptom that's being presented as a result of the autoimmune condition. Oftentimes, as a result, what we're also doing is using medications that are going to modulate the immune system so that it dampens the immune response. Again, this is what we call a downstream medicine approach. We are dealing with the problem as it's showing up and not necessarily peeling back the onion to look upstream and see what's happening and what's causing that disruption. So from a functional perspective, which is on the left side of the screen, we're looking at a systems-based approach. In other words, we're looking at the constellation of systems that are all interconnected, that all impact each other, and how that interplay then creates the root cause of that disruption that results in an autoimmune condition. And when we talk about autoimmunity, we're talking about all of them, right? We're talking about whether that's Crohn's or Hashimoto's or rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis. It's all of them, regardless of the organ system that we're addressing. That's because autoimmune disease is actually a disruption of the immune system with the help of certain genetics. With the help, we're going to talk about the impact of gut health. We're going to talk about the impact of certain triggers. But ultimately, it's a disruption of the way the body perceives danger and therefore starts dysregulating the immune response as a result. So what is autoimmune disease? There is estimated to be 80 different types of autoimmune diseases as defined by the NIH. It is defined genetically driven disease with some environmental factors. So even under the standard definitions, we're saying that there are environmental factors that can drive this disease. It's the development of antibodies, as well as the dysregulation of certain immune responses that then creates essentially messaging that targets specific cells within the body. So you're supposed to be attacking these external organisms, and for some reason it's misfiring, and now it's attacking the joint tissue or the muscle tissue or the tissue that lines the GI tract, etc. Right? It is thought to impact 23.5 million Americans, according to the NIH. However, that is likely very understated number, since it is so challenging to diagnose, that many people go undiagnosed. And we even saw in the chat that a lot of people had this challenge of actually getting a proper diagnosis of their autoimmune disease. It's much more common in women and in Caucasians in general. That's likely due to certain genetic predispositions. And it also happens to come in clusters. So often when you have one autoimmune disease, it's much more likely that you will develop a second, a third, and a fourth. And because of this genetic predisposition, often those clusters, because of where they're located in the genes, come together. And so once you get the first trigger for a certain autoimmune disease, there's an increased likelihood of developing the second, the third, the fourth, assuming that you don't actually address that underlying trigger that's sort of wreaking havoc on the immune system. And generally speaking, the standard of care, once it is finally diagnosed and identified, often involves some type of immune regulating medication that's going to alter the way that the immune system responds and reacts, as well as maybe pain management, because often there's pain associated with autoimmune disease. And that might also include NSAIDs, as well as steroids and opioids, and then whatever else might be needed. So for example, if you have a Hashimoto's, you might also then need thyroid medication in order to regulate the thyroid. So from a functional medicine perspective, there are 5 aspects that sort of turn this idea that once you have an autoimmune disease, that's it, case closed. You're just sort of going to have to figure out which immune modulating medication you have to be on, and that's it, case closed. From a functional perspective, we do actually very strongly acknowledge that genes absolutely play a role. However, environmental exposures, whether they be toxins, bugs like viruses or bacterial infections, Lyme, mold, etc., lifestyle factors, especially things like stress, sleep, exercise, whether it be excessive or inadequate amounts of exercise, as well as diet, all play a much larger role in outcomes than genetics alone. So just because you have a genetic predisposition doesn't always mean that you will develop that autoimmune disease in the absence of these environmental factors. Number 2, autoimmune disease exists on a spectrum. It can move forward, meaning that you can have sort of factors, sort of like pre-diabetes. You can have like pre-autoimmune disease predisposition, and then you can move into the first autoimmune disease, and then that could progress and get worse, and then you could potentially develop a second, a third, a fourth, etc. However, it also can move backwards, so we can see regression of the autoimmune disease and a reversal of those 4, 3, 2, 1 different autoimmune diseases. We also know that all autoimmune disease is rooted in the same primary disorder, the immune system, whereas sometimes when you are dealing, and some of you might have had this experience if you yourself have an autoimmune disease, where if you have an autoimmune disease that impacts your gut, you go to the GI specialist for that. And if you have an autoimmune disease that impacts your thyroid, you're going to go to an endocrinologist for that. And so you're sort of feeling a little disjointed. But ultimately, it's all under the immune system. And that's sort of the part that we want to focus on, is how to re-regulate that. And it's not necessarily an organ-specific disease, but rather a whole system. And that not only helps us to identify that potential of developing the second or third, etc. disease, but it also helps us understand how to help to support the entire sort of root of it, so that we can have that synergistic support and prevent progression and even get into remission. It's also symptom relief with medication should always be an option, and I don't want anybody to shame you out of using medication, whether that means that you're using pain medication or even immune modulators. That's fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. However, know that you have options, and there's always adjunctive holistic therapies. And in my personal opinion, I think that any approach that's going to use medications should try to optimize the outcome of those medications and minimize the risk. And that often means addressing those lifestyle factors that we talked about. And last but not least, diet plays a key role in both the etiology and the remission of autoimmune disease. So whether we're talking about the presentation and the likelihood of you developing the autoimmune disease or the remission of the autoimmune disease, you want to make sure that we're addressing not only that diet piece, but that overall lifestyle modification. Does that all make sense? I'm seeing you guys be a little quiet in the chat. All right, awesome. That's all making sense. Sounds like we're all on board. Does this resonate? Does this sound good? Does this feel good? This is what you're here for. All right, awesome, awesome, awesome. I like chatting with you guys. This is really what I'm here for, is to chat with you. So what exactly is this healthy immune system that I keep alluding to, Larry? You keep saying that is a misfiring of the immune system. Well, what exactly an immune system misfiring is? So first, basic physiology. We've got two arms of our immune system. The immune system, first of all, is the most brilliant, complex set of like dominoes you've ever seen in your life. There's two arms of it. One arm is the innate, one arm is the adaptive. The innate is often called sort of the primal or more basic immune arm, and the adaptive is considered sort of the more specific, more sophisticated arm. I think of it like the innate is like a grenade. You sort of throw a grenade, it's going to get a lot of collateral damage, but it's going to get the job done more likely than not. The adaptive is more like a sniper. It's going to be very specific about what it's going to target, and it's going to target it exactly the way it needs to be targeted in order to be addressed, right? You can have patterns of hypofunction of the immune system, right? So I often hear phrases like, we need to rev up our immune system to make it stronger. And yes, that is the case when you've got parts of the immune system that are under performing, but there's also patterns of hyper reaction or hyperfunction. And so it's, in those cases, not really appropriate to talk about revving up the immune system. So what we really want to achieve is a balance and making sure that those arms and all the little parts associated with them are responding the right way at the right time to the right thing and triggering the right pattern as a result, right? And all of this sits on top of this brilliant barrier system basically that originates at the gut interface. Has anybody here heard about, heard the phrase that immunity begins in the gut, or the gut is responsible for our immune system? Yes, this sounding familiar. Absolutely. So this is why 80% of your immune system originates in the gut. Even better, your microbiome, the bacteria that are responsible for sort of being and living and creating all these beautiful communities in our GI tract and throughout our bodies, actually also can communicate with our immune system. They actually also communicate with our genes, and they help to guide what's called the epigenetic expression of not only our immune system, but how our body responds in general to either danger or to safety signals. And this is part of why it's so important to address the lifestyle factors, including stress and sleep, because that's part of sort of what sends those stress signals. And then diet and the components of food that we're going to talk about, they can go in and they speak kind of to and through the microbiome. But what's really important is that that barrier along the GI tract maintain the right integrity. It can't be too loosey-goosey and open and let too many things in, but it also can't be too tight and closed off and not allow enough things to cross through. And so then we start to talk about intestinal permeability or leaky gut, and we start to talk about the mucosal lining that lines the GI tract, and the integrity and the health and the relative abundance of the right kinds of bacteria in the right places, and that makes up the barrier, the GI barrier. Making sense? Sounding good? All right, awesome. So this is where it starts to get juicy. I don't know that you're going to be able to, I don't think there's audio on this, so I'm just going to play this video. I don't know if there's any football fans out there. I'm not here to start any riots or anything or ask who anybody's team is, but if you want to drop it in the chat, you can. But when you are on the offensive line, your job is to try to break through the defensive line. If you've got a great defensive line, your defensive line is going to prevent the offense from breaking through, and therefore the offensive team cannot advance further. That is literally the job of the barrier. And the barrier starts in your mouth. It starts with the acidity of the saliva in your mouth. It continues into the acidity of your gut, of your stomach. It starts to prevent things from coming through because it's just going to kill it off with that acidity. And then the actual literal permeability of the GI tract is going to then prevent things from sneaking in even further and wreaking havoc. And in all of that, if there is a mess in terms of your ability to digest, if there's a mess in terms of you don't have the right pH in your gastric space, if there's bacteria that's in the wrong place and or there are species that are missing, that is going to upset the integrity of that lining. That's going to start to cause some local inflammation, some local inflammatory response. That's going to mess up the mechanism that's responsible for making the immune system. And as a result, that's going to screw up and mess with the way that your body responds all over systemically. So this is essentially one of the basic underlying principles that we talk about in functional medicine, is what's happening in the gut and how we can address gut integrity, improve digestion as a foundational piece towards regulating the immune function. Awesome. Awesome. Thank you. I'm loving all. Thank you so much for the kind comments. Sometimes it's a little lonely on these virtual stages, so it's really nice to see all the positive feedback. So I really appreciate you. So just as a review, you've got your defensive line and your offensive line. As I said before, your defensive line are the literal physical barriers, the fact that you can't get through from inside the GI to outside. Chemical barriers, that includes the digestive enzymes and the stuff that's in your saliva, for example. Enzymatic barriers, the pH of the stomach, the actual enzyme, sorry, I said it backwards. The chemical barriers are the pH, and the enzymatic barriers are the digestive enzymes. And then there's the actual lining itself that's often referred to by the place that it resides. So for example, the GULT is the lymphatic tissue, the gastrointestinal lymphatic tissue that is responsible for protecting the gastro. Then we have one on the respiratory tract, and we have one on our skin, and we have one literally everywhere as part of that defensive line. And then there's the offensive, and that includes your innate and your adaptive response. So when we talk about regulating the immune system, we don't just talk about the offense and the innate and the adaptive response, although it's a big part of it. We want to also make sure that the integrity of the defensive line is also there. So when we have a leaky gut, when we have a leaky barrier, when we have issues with digestion, that's going to create a significant gap. That is, in my opinion, sort of where it all starts. And then the other stuff starts to get complicated when we don't address the first part. So what is exactly the tipping point? So you've got maybe like these preceding factors or antecedents, as we call them in functional medicine. You've got genetics, you've got maybe a family history, maybe you're female, and so that increases your risk for autoimmune disease. Maybe you already developed one autoimmune disease, right? And maybe you have intestinal permeability and dysbiosis. And then you get hit with a virus. Maybe it's COVID. Maybe it's an EBV infection that never went away, or a herpes infection that keeps coming back every time you're stressed out, or maybe it's mold, or maybe it's Lyme, right? Maybe it's food reactivities. Maybe it's a food that you keep getting exposed to. You're not quite aware that you're reactive to it, or maybe you're just eating it anyway because it's delicious. And that is creating sort of underlying immune disruption and dysregulating your gut. Maybe it's an environmental trigger that Lara's going to talk about a little bit later, or maybe it's stress or trauma, and that includes big T trauma, little t trauma, transgenerational trauma, as well as physical trauma, like you got in a car accident or you have an injury or anything like that. So where exactly is the tipping point is going to be a different point for everybody. Sometimes it's a combination of things, and the body is beautifully resilient. And I find it usually takes quite a bit for the body to finally say, all right, you know what? I can't do this anymore, Mary. I gotta, like, I'm raising my hand. I give up. We got to fix this, right? And usually it takes quite a bit of these things. It's not usually like one thing. So this is a general summary of what I call sort of the drivers of immune disease. That there's your GI function, which is sort of what we concentrated on and talked a little bit about. Then after that, you've got dietary factors we're going to get into. So the macros, micros, as well as really focus on the phytos, and you'll see why I'm going to focus on the phytos. And then, of course, there's inflammation. Other reasons why you might have an inflammatory response includes maybe having metabolic syndrome or insulin resistance or hormonal dysregulation. Stress, whether that be, again, over-exercise or under-exercise, not managing your stress adequately, having an imbalanced HPA access, or adrenal fatigue or chronic fatigue. Chronic exposures, again, I'm not going to go ahead too much into that. I know Laura's going to cover that, but chronic exposures in and of themselves could be a major trigger for autoimmune disease. And then the presence of chronic infections, again, that could be viruses. And I put those first because they're very, very highly associated with autoimmune disease, as are tick-borne illnesses and fungal infections and mold. So when you have a breach in the defensive line, i.e. maybe leaky gut, maybe you have a unprocessed antigen, your GI tract isn't doing a great job breaking down proteins, and therefore you are more likely to react to foods or triggers or environmental allergens. That creates essentially this disruption of the immune system. That's often associated foundationally with autoimmune disease, and this increased permeability has been associated with what's called endotoxemia, which means that dysbiosis in the gut is creating the systemic response that then is dysregulating the systemic autoimmune response. That's why you can have leaky gut, but then have a thyroid autoimmune condition, for example. And I just love to quote this guy because he's way ahead of his time, and he deserves like a high five for coming up with this. In 1907, death begins in the colon, and he was one of the first scientists credited with understanding that there must be something about these bugs that inhabit us, and that they're somehow working with us to help to support and normalize not only bowel health, but likely overall health in general. And he sort of recognized the idea that gut health is sort of essential and primary to overall health, gut health. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. I just sort of put this here for the nerds out there. But treatment considerations, when we talk about the way that we address leaky gut, we are often talking about what's called a 4R or 5R protocol. Sometimes people call it a 6R protocol. So you might hear these terms thrown around, but essentially the idea is to address whatever might be triggering it, remove those triggers, improve digestive function, replace the digestive enzymes, as well as potentially some of the bacteria that might be missing, the good guys that might be missing, support the growth and the regrowth of the commensal bacteria as it is, and then repair the gut lining, sort of spackle that mucosal lining so that you address any of the intestinal permeability. And then the rebalance is my favorite part, because this is the part that addresses the lifestyle factors and is sort of the short-term and the long-term piece of this, addressing the HPA axis, addressing sleep, stress, exercise, and of course, diet. And how do you make that sustainable? So the food you eat can either be the safest, most powerful form of medicine or the slowest form of poison. So essentially the food that you're eating, now I think food is wonderful. I think food is amazing. And we can go on and on about reasons why food all of a sudden has become a problem. And it's not the food itself. There's nothing inherently wrong with gluten or wheat or dairy for that matter. It's the way it has changed and been processed and is coming into contact with our more ancient systems that's creating the problem. And so once we sort of understand that, we could de-villainize the food, and we can hopefully start looking at more system-based solutions, but more importantly, understanding what food is doing within your body and how you're responding to it, and what's going to be the best way to optimize your health so that you can really maximize on the food and the deliciousness of it all. All right, basic nutrition. So most of us are familiar with macronutrients, micronutrients, right? Macronutrients, carbohydrates, fibers, fats, proteins, your micronutrients, your vitamins, your minerals, and some of the antioxidants actually overlap with these micronutrients. And then there are your phytonutrients. Have anybody heard the term phytonutrients before? Just chat me in the chat, let me know so I know how much to go into it. Yes, 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 yes. And you talked to Dr. Deanna Minnick yesterday, so I'm sure she got into this. So I'm not going to go into too much other than to repeat. These phytonutrients, these are the active pigments, these compounds in the foods that give plant-based foods their color, their diversity, that help them survive and to avoid being killed off by bugs and bacteria. These are the guys that help to support our own antioxidant detoxification pathways. They interact with our microbiome, and they help support positive epigenetic translation so that we're actually coding for wellness and healing versus disease. I don't know about you, but I think that's pretty powerful. And so when we talk about nutrition, we've often been accused of just focusing on macronutrients. Like, what are your macros? Are you getting the right balance of fat, protein, carbohydrates? And unfortunately, for a long time, villainizing certain macronutrients, saying, well, fat is really bad for you, or all carbs are terrible, or whatever it is. But that's not really the case, and we know that. Often it's quality over quantity, and then there are different proportions. And yeah, absolutely, too many carbohydrates for certain people could definitely create autoimmune triggers, but simultaneously, not everybody needs to be also on a low carb sort of keto leaning diet, and that's where personalized nutrition comes in. Micronutrients, obviously getting a diversity of micronutrients from your food is really important. Recognizing also that the quality over the years of our food and the nutrient density of our food has sort of diminished over the years. And so where we might have gotten away with eating 4 or 5 vegetables and fruits a day 100 years ago, the soil depletion has caused reduced nutrient density in our food. So that's part of the reason why we sort of need to eat more of them. And then if you're also trying to heal and compensate for nutrient deficiencies, that means you might also need to eat a little bit more or even supplement. And then of course, phytonutrients. And the easiest way to sort of explain phytonutrients in a really quick way is eat the rainbow. You're not only going to get a diversity of those phytonutrients, but you're also going to cover some of those micronutrients at the same time. But I would also say that food and nutrition should also focus on the microbiome. And yes, fiber can support that, phytonutrients can support that, but eating traditionally fermented food as well is really important. Making sure that we understand your own personalized genetics, and your genetics might mean that you need to eat more of this and less of that, and it might mean that even your sister or brother might need to eat the complete opposite of you. The environment that you live in, what is appropriate for you. Even if somebody had, let's just say you have a twin and they live in, I don't know, the Middle East somewhere, and you live over here. Well, your environment might dictate a completely different set of nutrient needs, and your lifestyle as a result of that environment might also alter your needs. And your intention. I'm sorry, I don't care how clean that plate is. If you're eating that and you're not feeling awesome about it, or you're not enjoying it, that's probably just as bad as you really enjoying a burger. So whatever it is, whatever intention you put behind the food is really important. And what I have found is that folks who have had a history of having issues with food, where food has been reactive for them, or maybe they were in an environment where it caused them to have a disordered eating, or maybe food is sort of brings up bad memories for them, that association, no matter how well they try to eat, carries with them every single mealtime. And so now the intention behind the food is no longer healing, it's no longer supportive, right? So really think about what you're saying and doing as you're putting the food in, as well as what's your environment. Are you watching the news? Are you focusing on your food? Are you grateful for what you're eating? Are you sort of resentful at what you have to eat? All of those things all work together in order to define, in my opinion, nutrition. So real quick, proteins, obviously I just put this in here more as a kind of coverall for us, but proteins, you all know, amino acids, it could come from animal as well as plant sources. Fats, you want to try to get a diversity of fats, and there are more anti-inflammatory, immune supporting fats, particularly those essential fatty acids like fish oil, nuts, seeds, etc. And then you want to try to avoid trans fats. I would say those are probably trans fats and highly processed fats, and vegetable oils are probably the big ones I would say in terms of avoidance, but I'm a very big inclusion, kind of let's get a little bit of everything, including saturated fats. And carbohydrates, having the right balance and mixture. There's the right time for simple carbohydrates, but most of the time we probably want to lean on those complex carbs for various reasons, not just the nutrient profile, but also how it supports the microbiome. All right, so that is a quick and dirty on sort of the nutritional piece. Let's get into a little bit of the therapeutic aspect when it comes to autoimmune disease, right? So autoimmune disease, one of the big things that we sort of understand about it is that basic foundational gut health piece. So anything that we're going to talk about is always going to want to focus on how do we support gut health? How do we support the microbiome? How do we make sure that the lining of the GI tract is intact and is the right amount of permeability and supporting the production of the right kinds of immune response? Part of that is going to be fiber. Part of that is going to be phytonutrients, and part of that is going to be traditionally fermented food. So that's your kefir, your kombucha, your kimchi, your yogurt, if you can tolerate dairy, or your non-dairy yogurts and fermented like nut milks, for example. But the idea, again, is to lean into the phytonutrients and the diversity of the phytonutrients. They have multiple layers in which they're working. They're antioxidants. They are helping to support detoxification. They're helping to support the microbiome. They are impacting your epigenetics. They're also modulating your hormonal response, as well as the way that you're responding to your environment. So again, one thing you walk away with today is this diversity of color concept. I'm not going to go through this because I think y'all kind of got a little bit of this rundown. You guys can walk through this at your leisure at another time. I want to make a quick note about regenerative farming and organic practices, and this is a question I get a lot. Do I really have to eat organic? Is it worth it? And as I sort of alluded to earlier, nutrient density is probably the number one reason why I might say, you know what, if you can afford it and you have access to it, then I would recommend buying local and or buying organic, because it's going to be produced in a method that's going to preserve the nutrient density. Second reason, and I'm sure Lara will agree and probably will echo me on this, is the potential exposure to pesticides and other pollutants that are less likely to be in organic. That doesn't mean they're completely free of it, but they're much less likely to be in them. And so generally speaking, again, if you could afford it, you have access to it. If you can get your hands on local organic practices, they don't have to necessarily say organic, but organic practices, local farms, CSA, etc., that's going to be your best option. And if you have questions about that, I can share some resources at another time. Some of the autoimmune dietary approaches, some brilliant people got together and were like, hold on, there's got to be a way for us to simplify it, put it in a simple way, explain it to people so that they could go on and sort of deal with their autoimmune disease on their own. And there's a few different ways to do it. You've probably heard of, like, there's 1,000,001 elimination diets out there. And the idea is literally any diet that removes any food category for any amount of time, whether it be for removed for 2 weeks and reintroduced, or it be like removed forever, is considered an elimination diet. When it comes to autoimmune disease, most of them you'll see are going to remove gluten and dairy. Those are going to be the big ones. Many will also remove eggs, and many will remove soy. And there's different reasons why they're being removed. And again, I can't reiterate enough, there's nothing inherently evil about any of those foods. In fact, I might argue that they're actually could be very healthy and good for you, and particularly part of traditional eating. However, they're also creating some of these sort of large pockets of autoimmune reactivity and GI issues. One of the most popular I've come across is AIP, or autoimmune protocol, which actually takes out multiple layers of foods, including dairy, gluten, eggs. It also removes nuts, seeds. I believe it leans paleo, completely grain-free and legume-free, although that might allow certain amounts. And my experience with this has been is that although a lot of people will often experience initial symptom relief, many do not have adequate support to then go from there. So it's fine to remove the things that are potentially triggers, but if that's not coupled with a protocol that helps support GI function, restore the gut microbiota, address nutrient deficiencies, help you stay sustainable, help you keep a good, healthy relationship with food as well as with the people around you, then that's not going to probably work long term. So that's my sort of negative on the AIP, although I have to say I've seen a lot of people do really well. At least initially. Wall's protocol, I like a little bit better than AIP. Dr. Terry Walls, if you don't know her story and you like me to pick me up, go Google her TED Talk about her own experience with MS and tell me that you could get through that without crying at the end, because that woman is like just amazing. She actually was able to reverse her own MS, get out of a wheelchair, and she's just a boss. She's just amazing and brilliant. And so she developed this protocol that has multiple approaches. It has a vegetarian option, an omnivore option. It's 3 different layers, and you can sort of create your own adventure. so that you can optimize your health. What I really love about it is that, yes, it might remove certain potential triggers. However, it really, really focuses on what to add in and how to optimize not only your gut health, but your detoxification pathways, hormone health, and of course, immune function. And then last but not least, I have to give a shout out to my fellow functional medicine pharmacist, Isabella Wentz, who's an Hashimoto's expert, and she has a Hashimoto specific autoimmune protocol called the Hashimoto's protocol. And all of these, you'll see a similar pattern where they'll take out the sort of big triggers. And then with the Hashimoto's piece, she's focusing specifically on nutrient-dense foods that are relevant to thyroid and adrenal health. And so that's a slight spin on her, on that. And she's got a couple books out and some really great resources. And she's just a lovely human. So pros and cons, I sort of alluded to some of these before. The elimination diet, gluten and dairy is most commonly eliminated. Many might have other things. A 6-point elimination is very, very common. And then other versions of this are low FODMAP or remove histamine or nightshades, etc. There's tons of them out there. Almost everybody has a slightly different variation on this. These could be also based on food sensitivity testing. However, that's not always indicative of something that you have to be off of long term. So I highly, highly recommend referring to a nutritionist who can then guide you on reintroductions as well as on a gut healing protocol from there. AIP, again, similarly removes a lot of the common triggers. It removes grains, legumes, as well as some fruits, nuts, and seeds. I sort of went over the WALS protocol as well, so I'm not going to reiterate that. And then there's the sort of summary on the Hashimoto's protocol. So that hopefully can help you sort of keep those straight. And when it comes to why certain foods are chosen over others, it comes down to the biochemistry and some of the pathways that we want to support. They include detoxification pathways like methylation, glutathione support, but they also include the antioxidant response pathways and the reduction of what's called oxidative stress and the support of the mitochondria through things like NRF2 and NF-kappa B. There's also amazing research coming out on the glycome, which is essentially a carbohydrate complex that lines like every single epithelial cell in our body that also is communicating with our immune system. And we think that's part of the reason why we're finding so much medicinal qualities from mushrooms, along with other herbs that help to support this complex carbohydrate layer. And some of these environmental toxins and inflammation might be destroying the glycome, and hence why we're sort of in this mess that we're in. So these particular compounds, when we put them all together, they're going to enhance antioxidant reserve. They're going to upregulate the capacity to neutralize reactive oxygen species, which are essentially the byproducts of metabolism. You naturally are creating these ROS, reactive oxidative species, like little sparks of fire every time you metabolize something. And antioxidants come in and put it out with a fire hose, essentially. So these particular mechanisms help to upregulate and neutralize that process. And then they also help to modulate inflammation, immune response, actually could also reduce pain, and is part of the reason why a lot of autoimmune diseases are accompanied by pain. Not the only reason, but part of the reason. So what exactly are these pharmacy foods? I put them into categories for you. So the first one is colorful, non-starchy root vegetables, cruciferous vegetables, alliums. Remembering to eat the rainbow and getting diversity. Green all the time isn't always better than having that diversity. And, you know, really leaning into, yes, the dark leafy greens are going to have these complex phytonutrient patterns, but also the reds and the oranges that contain things like resveratrol and beta-carotene that have immune modulating effects. Low glycemic, colorful fruit, especially berries, avocados, olives, and coconuts. And yes, olives and coconuts are fruit. Fermented foods, pre and probiotic foods, that includes dairy if you are not sensitive to dairy, or could be non-dairy alternatives, including, you know, like your coconut kefirs, for example, or fermented vegetables, right? As well as kefir water and kombucha. Diversify anti-inflammatory fats. Olive oil in particular has a lot of research on its ability to help to modulate the immune system for multiple reasons, as well as fish and fish oil, nuts and seeds. And ghee in particular, although is a saturated fat, and you might like inherently think that's probably not great, Ghee has high amounts of vitamin A as well as butyric acid, which help to modulate the immune system, and butyric acid helps to sort of support that GI lining and integrity. And then grass-fed animal proteins and organ meats, including eggs if they're tolerated, bone broth, dark and white meat, both are fine, as well as organ meats, which are really power-packed, nutrient-dense foods. And that is it. Thank you so much for your attention. Tim, I think I went a little bit late. My apologies. Hopefully you guys enjoyed that. I know I was talking like super crazy fast. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. I spend an exorbitant amount of time on Instagram. So if you're on there, please give me a follow and shoot me a message. Thank you so much.
For the past 35 or 40 minutes. So much great information there. Thank you so much. And no worries about going over. We will go right into Laura's presentation. And Laura, as long as you're okay staying a little bit late, it's fine with me.
I'm totally fine to stay as late as necessary. And let me get my slide situation set up.
Cool.
And we'll just dive right in. Can you see? Wait a second. Hold on. That's not right. What is happening here? Tab, window. Here we go. Okay, that works. That looks better. All right, so you can see my screen, yes?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, excellent. All right, so I don't need to see that thing. It's grayed out for me. That's a little unusual. Okay, so we're going to be talking about environmental toxins, and there's a lot of dovetail between what I'm going to be talking about and what my fellow Laura just talked about. And I'll just start by saying, you know, this is just like what the last presentation we just wrapped up. This is a snippet of an enormous conversation, and there's no way that I can really squeeze what I want to squeeze out and relay to you in 30-ish minutes. This is a tall order. So I'm also going to be talking fast to try to get through everything. There is a recording, so you guys can rewatch this as necessary to really extract some of that. And then like Laura, I'm also going to be sticking around afterwards. So I don't need to introduce myself because I already did that. So I like to start with a little bit of context because oftentimes people are talking about environmental toxins, environmental chemicals, environmental contaminants. And we don't actually know what it is that we're talking about. So to get everybody on the same page, I like to start with some context, and that requires us to kind of look at this bigger picture. So worldwide, there are over 350,000 chemicals and chemical mixtures that are registered for production. We used to think that the number was about 100 to 150,000. Of registered chemicals. Every country in the world has different policies that regulate chemicals. Some require registration, others don't. This is kind of why the total tally has been a bit of a black hole. We don't actually know, which is a problem in and of itself. And certainly not all of these chemicals are bad or harmful. I like to say that right out of the gate. In truth, everything is a chemical. Our hormones are chemical. All of those delicious phytonutrients that Dr. Zacharias was just talking about, those are all chemicals. So chemicals in themselves are not bad. In the field of environmental health, when we are discussing chemicals, we are specifically discussing chemicals that are known or are suspected to be harmful to humans, animals, or wildlife. And I think that distinction is really important to make because we often get detractors in this space that like to kind of poo-poo this field, despite there being decades and decades and thousands, hundreds of thousands of studies really validating that this is a serious problem. But there are always people that like to kind of poo-poo it and be like, everything is a chemical. So yeah, they're right. Everything is a chemical. And we know that this vast proliferation of chemicals in the environment has resulted in chemicals showing up in us, in people. So in the United States, the CDC has been looking for chemicals and finding chemicals in the human population for a very long time. They track them through their long-running human biomonitoring studies, specifically NHANES, or the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. This is population-based survey designed to collect information about health and nutrition status of US household populations. This is research that has found hundreds of environmental chemicals or their metabolites in blood, urine, serum, and breast milk, from pesticides and heavy metals to nonstick chemicals and flame retardants. So these are all chemicals that are showing up in our bodies. The most recent report shows, this was from 2019, they update it periodically, shows more than 212 man-made chemicals measured in the US population. Some of these chemicals are measured in 99% of people tested. If you follow me on social media, I'm there at Environmental Toxins Nerd. I just posted a little while ago that John Oliver's HBO show did a segment last night on PFAS chemicals, and the figure that he shared specifically was at 99.97%, I think it was, of people tested had PFAS chemicals in their bodies. So that is, in some instances, for some chemicals, the state of the situation that we're in. What this tells us is that exposure is ubiquitous. We are all being exposed to some degree. That a chemical is present in our bodies does not automatically mean that it's causing harm. But the concern is that when we start looking into the data about the levels of chemicals that can, for example, cause negative health issues in animals, in rodent studies, and then we see within the epidemiological data similar levels of chemicals or comparable levels of chemicals in the human population relating to the same conditions that we know that are showing up in the rodent population. We can't test chemicals on people, which is why we kind of have this situation where we have to do animal testing, animal research, and then look at epidemiological data and make some very informed inferences. And it's a very imprecise situation, but that's just the reality of it. And again, so people, sort of detractors of this topic, like to kind of jump on that, but that's just the way the science in this area works. There's also a lot of research indicating that these chemicals are we are being exposed to these chemicals in utero. And this is also where, and I don't have a slide on this because I had to condense this down so much. There is a field of research that talks about the fetal origins or the fetal basis of adult disease. And that's really looking at these low-level chemical exposures or other factors, whether it's stress or trauma during pregnancy, and how those factors can sometimes be the trigger for a disease that does not manifest for 30 or 40 years. And so that lag period makes it really hard to kind of pin the tail on the donkey and saying, oh, it was this chemical that caused this problem. So that's another sort of tricky aspect in this space. But in 2009, I think it was, the Environmental Working Group did this first ever study of its kind. There have been follow-up studies since. I have a follow-up slide on that coming up, on umbilical cord blood of 10 newborns. And they found hundreds of industrial pollutants, carcinogens, neurotoxins, reproductive toxins. And that really kind of shook our understanding of how we sort of pass chemicals on to our offspring. And like I said, follow-up studies, and these are, you can have access, I'm assuming, to you can zoom in on the slides during the replay. And these are all more recent studies that are looking at similar things, finding, 59 potentially harmful chemicals, 15 unique chemicals, 90% of samples, these are all human studies, had PFAS and PFOA, which are two, I think there should be PFOS and PFOA, which are two types of PFAS chemicals. And then recently there was a study on microplastics showing up in human placenta. So really what this is just telling us is that we are being exposed. We don't always know what the implications of those are. There was just another study that was released just in the last couple of weeks looking at microplastics in feces of babies and adults. And we don't know the implications of that yet. There's a lot of we don't know in this space, but based on what we do know, it's probably not great. And then it'll probably be another decade or so before we actually figure out what are the true health implications of that. So there's 100 different avenues that I can take this conversation about what are the implications of exposure. Because this is a class on autoimmune, I thought I'd shine the spotlight towards the direction of environmental chemicals specifically relating to immune health and autoimmunity. So that's where we're going to go. So just as my fellow Laura said earlier, 80% of our immune cells are found in the gut. The gut is the seat of the immune system, and the human digestive system is home to trillions and trillions of bacteria that collectively make up our gut microbiome. This is our first line of defense against foreign invaders. And these gut bacteria, technically not the first line, our skin is technically our first line of defense, our external skin versus our internal skin. But these gut bacteria play an enormous role in sort of the training of our immune system. And there is more and more research coming out showing that babies delivered by cesarean section, as well as those who had heavy antibiotic use as kids, have increased risk of allergies, autoimmune diseases, including respiratory issues like asthma and seasonal allergies, to autoimmune conditions like type 1 diabetes, in part because that gut flora has been compromised so early. And we know that compromised gut integrity, whether it's leaky gut, low gut microbe diversity, overgrowth of certain types of bacteria, is associated with a long list of immune issues, diabetes, obesity, inflammatory bowel disease, diabetes, hepatic diseases. Like, it's a really long list. So we also know that things like stress and poor diet, this is some of what Laura was just talking about, lack of exercise and even lack of sunshine can all negatively affect the health of the gut and the immune system. But toxicity also plays a very strong role, and Laura mentioned this as well. So we're going to look at some of the most common toxicants that we're exposed to. Some of you will have heard of these, some of them, maybe some of them, maybe not all of them, but we're going to start with the one that has the most sort of street cred, is BPA, so bisphenol A. I start here because it's the one that typically has the most recognition. We've seen labels that say BPA free on our products. We've probably seen headlines about BPA. It is one of the most ubiquitous chemicals in commerce. And BPA, there are many mechanisms of actions and many endpoints of how bisphenol A can have negative effects on our health, but we're really going to just looking at BPA's effect on the gut specifically, and then we'll kind of hit on maybe some of those other ones as well. So metabolites of BPA have been measured in 93% of people tested by the CDC. So, and that's data from, I think that was from 2014. So my hunch is that that figure can certainly be higher. And if not BPA, I don't have a slide on this. I don't think. It will likely be BPS or BPF, which are replacements that are, is what we refer to as a regrettable substitution. So manufacturers, when put under pressure by social groups or moms, which is moms actually were why BPA is no longer permitted for use in baby bottles, because they got real mad and made a big stink about it. And nobody wants to, from a PR perspective, be mad at a bunch of moms. So companies would take BPA out of their product, but bisphenols are a family of chemicals and there are many members of that family. And BPA or bisphenol A is only one member of that family. And so products that are labeled BPA free often are just replacing BPA with another member of the same family, predominantly BPS and BPF. And so while levels of BPA may be decreasing in the human population, levels of BPS and BPF are increasing as they're becoming more common as replacements. So just a note on that. 99% of BPA exposure, at least in children, comes from food, because food is packaged in packing materials like canned foods, for example, that contain BPA in them. And so that is the kicker there. Most of the research around BPA points to its role as an endocrine disruptor, so disrupting our endocrine system, with a long list of health issues associated with that mode of action. But there is new research that's found that BPA can lead to inflammatory bowel disease, which is this catch-all phrase that includes conditions like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, where there's just sort of chronic inflammation of the digestive tract. And so we see some animal studies that show that association being present. And authors of this study had stated, this is the first study to show BPA can negatively impact gut microbial amino acid metabolism in a way that's been associated with irritable bowel. So there's a lot of, I think we know, there's less that we know. There's so much more to know. I'll just say it that way. There's so much more for us to find out, and this research is ongoing, and we're constantly learning new things about the way that these chemicals can affect us. And what's challenging and sort of complicates the research process is that any single chemical, even the ones that I'm going to mention here, like I said earlier, they can have so many different endpoints in how they can be affecting us. For some people, it might be increased risk of breast cancer. For somebody else, it might be a fertility issue. For somebody else, it might be a gut issue. And there's not really a way for us to determine how that single exposure is going to manifest, or whether it will manifest in a symptom for somebody. So it's a very complicated sort of four-dimensional puzzle that we're still trying to figure out. This study, which was published in the journal Nature, found that mice that were exposed to low levels of BPA, and this is the level that currently that the EPA deems as safe, and I can certainly talk into that as well. I have lots to share on that. Around the time of their birth, led to immune system imbalances, altered glucose sensitivity, and a decrease in the beneficial bifidobacteria in their feces relative to control mice. So this really small level of exposure that the EPA deems safe in humans, when we expose mice to that, it really leads to these series of compromised immune and overall health issues. And really this paper highlights what I think is this kind of tangled web between the immune system and metabolic disease. And they point out that low-grade inflammation, which is a key feature of obesity and type 2 diabetes, due to this excess of pro-inflammatory cytokines, impair immune signaling, and that's part of what might be going on here. So there's also research into BPA as a trigger specifically for autoimmune diseases. I think this is interesting. This was a paper published in the journal Toxicological Sciences, found that BPA, along with DES, which is diethylstilbestrol, both estrogenic compounds, enhance autoantibody production, and they conclude that there might be an etiologic factor in the development of autoimmune disease. Like this might be part of what's triggering this. There was a 2014 paper by Datis Karazian. Some of you might know Dr. Karazian. He's a brilliant man. And this paper really highlights this potential role of BPA in the development of autoimmunity. And in it, he states, quote, so I'm going to go read this quote now, a growing body of evidence shows increased toxic loads deplete hepatic tolerance, which leads to overactivation of the innate and adaptive immune response and the development of autoimmune disease. Higher BPA concentrations were associated with increased abnormal liver function tests, animal studies demonstrate that BPA has the ability to generate reactive oxygen species, those ROSs that Dr. Zacharias was just talking about, and reduce antioxidant reserves and enzymes that are critical for hepatic phase 1 and 2 biotransformation. So BPA interferes with our antioxidant stores. It reduces our reserves of antioxidants, and we need those antioxidants to detoxify compounds like BPA. And so this is just another vote, another coin in the hat for everybody needs to go double down on their antioxidants as a preventative measure. It's not only about giving our body the biochemical materials that it needs to, deal with oxidation and those ROSs that are being produced, but they're nutrients that our bodies need, the liver specifically needs, to detoxify the compounds that we're being exposed to. So liver function is critical in this conversation about environmental toxins. This paper also writes BPA disruption of cytochrome P450. These are the primary enzymes responsible for the detoxification process. Disruption of cytochrome P450 enzymes may be a potential mechanism for autoimmune pathophysiology. So really interesting paper. You guys can go look that up if you want. BPA, like I mentioned earlier, is also an estrogenic compound, xenoestrogen, and increased circulating estrogens have demonstrated a relationship with greater autoimmune activity. And we are exposed to BPA primarily through plastics, through specifically polycarbonate plastic, not all plastic, through canned foods, through thermal paper like cash register receipts. These are coated in free BPA, so the exposure from things like cash register receipts is actually quite significant. It's why we can tell the difference, even with our eyes closed, between thermal paper and regular paper. The thermal paper feels kind of powdery. That powder is literally just BPA molecules. They're not even bound like they are in a can or like they are in plastic. So it's free BPA. There have been studies that shows that the use of hand sanitizer increases your absorption of that BPA. And so oftentimes, everybody's hand sanitizing now. Hopefully they're still doing that. I think there's still a good reason to do that. Asterisk, small print, provided that your hand sanitizer doesn't contain toxic chemicals, because some of them do. But the alcohol in those breaks up that fatty acid layer on your skin, which increases the absorption of chemicals. So endocrine disrupting chemicals, which BPA certainly is one of, there are many of these, can interfere with the synthesis of cytokines. These are the proteins that help regulate the body's immune responses in people who have autoimmune diseases, whether it's rheumatoid arthritis or Hashimoto's, sometimes have elevated levels of these cytokines in their bodies. Endocrine disrupting chemicals can lead to weakened immune systems or hyperactivity of immune responses, leading to autoimmune disease. This book, The Autoimmune Epidemic by Donna Jackson Nakazawa, is a wonderful read. She talks a lot about environmental chemicals and the role they play. So this is sort of the top book recommendation within the autoimmune conversation. So that's just one chemical. We'll kind of keep going through. I have a short list of chemicals to kind of get through. Phthalates are another endocrine disrupting chemical. These are also ubiquitous in the marketplace. They're found in a vast array of consumer products that we are all being exposed to. Fragranced items, whether it's your scented candles or your air fresheners or your reed diffusers, whether it's your personal care products, your household cleaners, anything that has a fragrance added, a chemical fragrance added, very likely contains phthalates. Phthalates are not part of the fragrance. They are an additive to the fragrance mixture that helps facilitate those fragrance molecules to adhere to your skin, to your clothes, to your hair. When we see TV commercials for, fabric softeners that make your clothes smell like, whatever mountain breeze, whatever it is, for like 6 months, it's because they're adding a lot of phthalates in to make sure that those chemical molecules stay put and they don't volatilize. And so that's the role that phthalates play, at least within fragranced products. They're also found in plastics, primarily in soft plastics. So if we think of plastics that are soft and flexible, like a shower curtain or a garden hose, we're rolling up into Halloween. So those kind of rubbery, stinky Halloween masks are often made with they're vinyl face masks, and they use phthalates to help soften that plastic. So those are all exposure sources to phthalates. These are, again, endocrine disruptors. They can exhibit both estrogenic and androgenic activity in humans. They're linked to fertility issues in both men and women, to developmental issues and behavioral issues in children, genital birth defects, particularly in males. We see this both in animal studies and mirrored in the human population. In mouse studies, dibutyl phthalate has been shown to alter the chemistry of an animal's immune system, predisposing them to developing contact allergies. So the topical contact dermatitis, things like that. Phthalates are also associated with allergies and asthma, but the key here is that we do have research that indicates that phthalates can interfere with the immune system. And certain types of phthalates are associated with chronic inflammatory diseases, including asthma and allergies in children. And these other chemicals are here that are listed on the slide. BPA, triclosan is an antibacterial, parabens, preservatives, and UV filters found in sunscreens, all associated with asthma. Okay, so let's talk about, so one point here, both of these chemicals are non-persistent. That means they don't build up in the body. When we're talking about heavy metals, which we're going to do next, these certainly can persist in the body, or they can at least have very long half-lives, but BPA and phthalates have very short half-lives. This means that we can excrete them if we give our bodies the chance. The reason why we're seeing levels of BPA and phthalates at 93 to 98% in the population is because we're taking them in faster than we're able to excrete them, and that means the levels are constant. And this is where we practice avoidance behaviors, and I'm going to get to that at the end. I know, I think it was Tim, possibly Dr. Zacharias, who'd mentioned this in the beginning, talking about like practical tips here. Everything that I'm talking about here are things that you as an individual can implement, but for those of you that are providers or practitioners, this is absolutely something that I think every practitioner should be weaving into the conversations that they're already having with clients and patients around the lifestyle changes that they're already making around nutrition and stress and sleep and getting good sunshine. We also should be talking about practically avoiding environmental exposures in all the places that are possible and accessible for us. And we know from intervention studies that if we reduce our intake of these chemicals, we can actually lower the levels of them in our body, in our urine, in only a few days. And that's pretty powerful research that we have to show that. So let's get into arsenic. Arsenic is one of the, I think it's the, I don't know if it was the EPA or the World Health Organization, top 10 chemical contaminants because it's so toxic, and we are all, not all, but we are very often exposed to arsenic. It is a major drinking water contaminant around the world. We don't have to get into the history here, but it's been around for a long time. It is an element, so it has really been around for a long time, but we have also harnessed arsenic and used it in things like arsenic-based pesticides, which were mostly phased out of use. And then some of the arsenic that we are exposed to in our groundwater is there because it's in the geography, it's in the, it's a geological variance. So depending on where you live, you might have higher arsenic in your water, either due to pollution or old pesticide use, or just because there happens to be more arsenic in the Earth's crust in the area where you live. Worldwide, over 100 million people are exposed to toxic levels or harmful levels of arsenic. In the US, it's around 2.1 million people. So it's a bit of a doozy. It's a bit of a doozy. Arsenic is a carcinogen. It is an endocrine disruptor. It degrades biofilms, which sometimes that can be good, but not in this instance. So it can lead to altered gut permeability, aka leaky gut. Environmentally relevant doses, what that means, sidebar, are the levels that we're just actually exposed to in the environment just by like being a human being on the earth and doing our normal everyday activities. So environmentally relevant doses have resulted in an increase in genes involved in the synthesis of LPS. This is an endotoxin that plays a big role in the sort of bacterial-driven inflammation. So again, this sort of dovetails a little bit with what Dr. Zacharias was sharing earlier. This is a 2014 paper that found that 4 weeks, just 4 weeks, 1 month of drinking arsenic-contaminated drinking water left rodents with alterations in their microbiome that led to a reduced ability to detoxify arsenic. So this is sort of this double whammy. Arsenic exposure messes with our microbiome in ways that can lead to inflammation, leaky gut, and a decreased capacity to detoxify itself. So it hinders our detoxification capacity, making that arsenic exposure that much more troubling. Chronic exposure to low levels of arsenic via drinking water has been associated with an increased risk of lung disease, which is pretty interesting because there's not that many exposures that are non-inhalation exposures that are linked to lung disease. And this is an ingestion exposure that's linked. Pretty interesting. So the authors of this study wrote, the lung appears uniquely sensitive to arsenic in that chronic ingestion of relatively low, non-overtly toxic doses can elicit increased disease risk, whereas other lung toxicants require inhalation to elicit similar disease risks. So pretty interesting. This is a 2006 paper here at the top in the Journal of Immunology that found that chronic exposure to arsenic in the human population is associated with immunosuppression and impairment of macrophage function. These are the white blood cells responsible for dealing with these foreign substances, toxins, microbes, cancer cells, viruses, etc. So highly relevant for us now. This is the lower study here on the slide is from 2009, and this found that, again, environmentally relevant low-dose arsenic exposure compromises the immune response to the influenza A virus. The primary exposure source to arsenic is in our drinking water. It's just one of hundreds of contaminants in our drinking water that can negatively affect our health. Arsenic has strong links to both disruption of the gut microbiome and immune system directly. So really guiding clients and patients to ensure that they're not consuming arsenic-tainted water or water that's contaminated with PFAS or lead or any of these other hundreds of contaminants is pretty key. So lead, obviously we know lead is super toxic. We used to think that lead poisoning was all or nothing, but the CDC in over the years, started to discover really there's no level at which children specifically, but people in general there's no level which would be considered safe. So there's no safe level of exposure. In this 2016 study here at the top, this was also in the journal Toxicological Sciences, found that perinatal lead exposure resulted in a decrease in bacteroidetes and firmicutes. These are changes in the gut microbiota in male mice that are highly associated with body weight. And then, and that's what both of these studies are. I'm talking so fast. This is like double speed. I'm trying to get through all of these. So apologies if you're trying to catch up, but this is what the replay will be for. Okay, so occupational exposures to lead. Most of what I've been sharing have not been related to occupational exposures. Those obviously tend to be higher. And those are sort of we look often first at occupational exposures because the connection is quite strong, and then we'll sometimes kind of turn back into the sort of regular population and be like, is this also happening there? So occupational exposures to lead have been shown to dysregulate the immune system by diminishing this sort of immunosurveillance, this monitoring process of the immune system, which is, trying to detect or destroy cells that shouldn't be there, etc. Lead exposure leads to an inflammatory cascade that can lead to respiratory, neurologic, digestive, cardiovascular, and urinary disease. Primary exposure sources to lead include drinking water, which is concerning, as 20 to 70% of ingested lead is absorbed into the body, so it's pretty absorbable. along with things like lead paint, if you're living in an older home, this is where we start to see some major economic and social disparities. So there are many Black and brown communities, low-income communities, all communities of color have disproportionate exposure to toxicants like lead, either through old homes, old building stock, old lead pipes, infrastructure that just hasn't been updated. So we see a lot of instances like this, and this is also a parallel for many of the exposures in this whole field, that there are some communities, specifically Black and brown and low income communities, that are disproportionately exposed. So this really goes back to that conversation around access and what is accessible. And these communities, unfortunately, often have least access to the organic food and the non-toxic skincare and household cleaners. And this is a very challenging space that I think that health professionals really would love to see more of them doing work in that area. We do know that lead does bioaccumulate in the body. It stores in our bone. It's mobilized during pregnancy, as well as during menopause when we're losing some of that bone mass. The lead that's stored in our bones kind of comes out into our bloodstream as that process takes place. So this means that we can continue to be exposed endogenously to lead long after an exogenous or external exposure has been stopped. So that is a just concerning reality. Okay, so last topic here, we're going to talk about pesticides. Dr. Zacharias mentioned this briefly. Pesticide is a generic term that includes herbicides, fungicides, insecticides, antimicrobials. There are thousands and thousands of different chemicals that are used as pesticides, and human exposure to pesticides is widespread. Worldwide, there's about close to 6 billion pounds of pesticides used each year. The US, we use about 1 billion pounds of pesticides, big numbers. These are not just applied to our food crops. They are applied to forests, to golf courses, certainly to lawns and parks, public parks. 50% of all pesticides used in the US are herbicides, like glyphosate and chlorpyrifos. According to the Endocrine Society's scientific statement on endocrine disrupting chemicals, this is a very long read, but a very excellent read. Exposure to organophosphate pesticides, the primary class of pesticides out there, along with among the general population, occurs primarily through the ingestion of food that contains low levels of pesticide residue, or through inhalation and or skin exposure in and around the home. So if you're using pesticides in your garden, or if your neighbors are, or if you live near a golf course, you're going to likely have increased pesticide exposure beyond the food that you actually intake. Oh, here's that Endocrine Society statement. And then even the CDC says that people are exposed to organophosphate insecticides by eating foods treated with these chemicals. That's where primarily our exposure is coming from, outside of an occupational space. The one that I'm going to talk briefly about is chlorpyrifos. This is there's a death knell here. This pesticide was banned, but it's still in the market right now. But 93% of people tested by the CDC have metabolites for chlorpyrifos in their urine. This is a pesticide that's used on crops like soy, bell peppers, kale, cilantro, nectarines, cranberries, green beans, all the healthy food that we want to be eating. This is why we move towards organic food. Like Dr. Zacharias said, it's not just about the increased nutrition that we need, those phytonutrients that we need. It's also because we're minimizing our exposure to these pesticides. In August of this year, the EPA finally, after like years and years and years of battling and going back and forth, decided to ban this pesticide for use on food crops. I don't remember exactly when that goes into effect. It's probably not for another couple of years, but at least we have a ban on the books. While there are many health effects associated specifically with this pesticide, within the context of gut and immune health, studies have found that chronic low-dose exposure to chlorpyrifos induces gut dysbiosis in rodents. This is rodent research, and led to a decrease in lactobacillus and bifidobacterium. And then another study, I don't have the slide up, the study citation on these ones. I have them in my notes, but they're not on the slide. Another study on chlorpyrifos found that the gut microbiome, found gut microbiome alterations that again resulted in inflammation, abdominal, intestinal permeability, aka leaky gut. There was also a study in Washington State on farm workers that were actually applying these pesticides. So that is an occupational exposure. And they found the profile of their oral microbiome in their mouths shifted seasonally in response to the pesticides they used on their farms. So really, really interesting research. The researchers saw pesticide associated spring and summer general reduction in the bacterial diversity in the study subjects. It persisted into the winter and spring, and they found that there was these long-lasting effects to that exposure. So that's a doozy. Okay, so this is where I like to pause and just say, take a deep breath. This topic is stressful, it's overwhelming, it's frightening, it's infuriating. It is all of those things, right? It is all of those things. Learning about this topic can definitely feel like a lot. And sometimes it can even feel disempowering. What I've kind of specialized in the last decade is trying to find the place where information and empowerment kind of intersects into this conversation, so that we're not just getting the bad news and going, well, we're all going to die, isn't this terrible? And that we're learning where we can intervene here in this process and take some actions to reduce our personal exposures that will overall lower our individual body burden and collective body burden. Many people in the health space, specifically professionals, practitioners, love to jump into the detox conversation. Like, oh, let's do a detox, let's do a cleanse. Those things can be great. They do have their place. And it's not typically where this conversation starts. We start by reducing the body burden of chemicals through what I call practical avoidance. That means where in our normal everyday lives, without going overboard and causing anxiety and stress in our daily activities, can we start making meaningful reductions in our exposure to these toxins or toxicants in ways that are measurable, that we can actually see if we did the testing. Most people aren't going to do the testing, that we can actually see reductions in these chemicals. The late Dr. Walter Crinian, who was one of the leading voices in environmental medicine, had this very tongue-in-cheek approach to talking about this very heavy topic. And he kind of outlaid these 5 steps to addressing toxicity. And step 1 is avoidance. Step 2 is avoidance. Step 3 is avoidance. Then we move to supplementation, where we can boost the body's natural capacity for detoxification, whether it's through something like glutathione or turmeric or some compounds that our phase 1 and phase 2 liver detox process will utilize. And only then do we move to detoxification. And his version of detoxification here was a physician assisted detoxification protocol, not just like I'm going to take activated charcoal binders, that kind of thing. But the point here is avoidance, avoidance, avoidance. That is how we start addressing this problem. And we do know that avoidance works. For example, multiple studies have shown that consuming a mostly organic diet, not even exclusively 100%, can lower pesticide levels in the urine by 80 to 90% in just 3 to 5 days. 3 to 5 days. So super powerful, super motivating data that shows that, yeah, we can actually have an impact on our exposures to these chemicals by avoiding them. It's just logic. It's totally logical. But we have data to confirm that. And that's good news. We also have, there's a Hermosa study, actually just posted about this study on my Instagram recently, that avoiding personal care products, this was a study done with teenage Latina girls, and they were like, for 3 days, we don't want you to use any personal care products that contain phthalates or parabens or triclosan, and then they measured their levels of those chemicals in their urine, and they dropped by 25 to 45% in just 3 days. And also there was another study that showed that hand washing and increased house cleaning, so vacuuming and dusting, for example, can lower the level of flame retardants in our urine by 43 to 62% in 1 week. Why? Because flame retardants are found in our upholstered furniture. They migrate out into the dust in our homes. And so if we clean that dust up regularly, it's not floating around in our air. And if we increase our hand washing, that means instead of eating our dinner on the sofa where we're touching our couch and getting flame retardants on our hands and then eating the popcorn and putting popcorn in our mouths, these two behaviors together can lower levels in really significant percentages in a very short amount of time. So I don't know where I'm at with time, but I'm hoping that we'll have time for questions. But I'm going to go through these last 2 slides pretty quickly because these are really there are action steps here to reduce exposures. My approach is to always start with things that are free and easy. We want to make the recommendations that we are providing to our clients and patients accessible regardless of their income or their home environment. We don't want to make this conversation overwhelming or inaccessible to people because then they won't do anything. And this is also true for nutrition advice, right? Like we want to make everything that we share accessible to folks. So first and foremost, open your windows. Let the chemicals that are off-gassing from your building construction and your furniture and your carpeting, et cetera, let them out. Open the windows. Take off your shoes indoors. Eliminate household fragrance items. Just stop buying those. Regularly wet dust and vacuum. People always ask, what's wet dusting? It's with a damp cloth or a microfiber cloth. That's it. Decline cash register receipts. This is an easy thing. Just say, no, thanks. I don't need that receipt. If you do need the receipt for tax purposes, put it in a Ziploc bag so that it's not rubbing up against, everything else in your purse or your wallet. And then once you've done that, you move on to these. You start eliminating or phasing out or minimizing, if you're able to, the consumption of canned foods. Eliminate plastic food storage containers, replace those with glass. Don't microwave anything in plastic. Prioritize organic foods. This includes dairy and meat products. Eat low food chain wild domestic seafood. I can speak for an hour on every single one of these topics, so I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to breeze through this list. Properly filter your drinking water, clean up those personal care products, and choose safer household cleaners. There are 24 other items I could list, but as we go down this list, they become more expensive and more complicated to address. And so they're sort of further down on our priority list because we start with things that are easy and accessible. So I know this has been a lot. I'm hoping that we still have time for questions. This is a topic that always generates tons and tons of questions. I don't have a slide here with my Instagram, but I'm like, maybe it's a Lara thing, or maybe it's just a nerd thing. I'm also extremely active, too active on Instagram. So please follow me there. I am there at Environmental Toxins Nerd. You can DM me, slide into my DMs. I'm happy to answer questions that you guys have. So great. I did. All right, sweet. We're good. Yeah? Okay, I just talked so fast.
No worries. That was, sheesh. There's so much there. I want to follow up. We'll start with the Q&A. We're way over time, but for those, folks who are going to watch the replay, and we still have a good amount of people here. So this question is for either of you. This came up for me, and I thought it would be really helpful for people who are working with clients. When you had this, the slide about persistent chemicals and, persistent organic pollutants, it just got me kind of thinking about, this process of cellular biotransformation and detoxification. And, some folks here might be familiar with, just conjugation and, phase 1, phase 2 detoxification. Could you maybe just give a little bit more context into why certain things are able to be easily excreted and then why other things tend to hang out for a little bit longer?
Yeah, so it's a little bit complicated. I'll do my best. So there's a couple of things. There's, whether the chemical is fat soluble or water soluble. Water soluble chemicals are easier to detoxify. Fat soluble chemicals have this affinity for the fat in our bodies. And so what happens is, as the detoxification process, or as we, I'll rephrase it. So we have these chemicals, these fat soluble toxins, they sequester in our adipose tissue. There are some researchers that hypothesize that this is actually a protective mechanism. It's obviously just a function of them being fat soluble. That's also why they're showing up in our fat tissues. But like I said, some hypothesize that this is a protective mechanism so that those chemicals are not free floating through our tissues or through our bloodstream. They're actually just being sequestered in our fat. When we burn fat, the actual fat gets burned because our bodies know how to utilize fat as a source of energy, but the toxins are not a source of energy. So through the enterohepatic recirculation process, those fat soluble toxins can actually concentrate in the body. So the fat gets burned off, but the toxins are left behind. And then those toxins are going, well, shit, I need a place to go. Well, maybe I need to find more adipose tissue because there's not enough here. And so then the body kind of, as this protective defense mechanism, will start putting on more weight. This is a class of chemicals that I'm referring to here are referred to as obesogens, because they can trigger this metabolic cascade that can lead to obesity. One of the mechanisms is just through them being fat soluble. So that's one of the ways. But then there's other things, when we have things like lead or fluoride, some of these chemicals or these compounds have affinities for different tissues. And if those tissues are bone tissues, then that's where those chemicals are stored. And unless we are making a human being, as in being pregnant or going through menopause, then those toxins that are stored in our bone, again, like lead and fluoride, they're not going to be mobilized. They're just going to stick there. And then we have chemicals that just happen to have, because of, of their chemical makeup, they've got extraordinarily long half-lives. And so if a chemical that has an extraordinarily long half-life is also a fat soluble chemical, like a PFAS chemical that can have a half-life of, 8 to 20 years plus in the human body, and it's fat soluble, and we have fat, and we all do, that it can live in, then it's just going to hang out in there. And so there's some of it is that aspect, right? And some of it is like, we just don't have the capacity to break down these compounds. So PFAS chemicals are referred to as forever chemicals. They have between 6 and 8 carbon bonds. The more carbon bonds something has, the harder it is to break down. And so if they don't degrade in the natural environment, which they don't, our bodies are going to have a really hard time figuring out, how do I disassemble this complicated molecule? And it doesn't matter how many liver supporting herbs or nutrients that we have, our livers just aren't capable of doing that. And the only way that we can meaningfully reduce, our levels in our bodies, frankly, is through reducing exposure to a lot of these persistent chemicals. I don't know if I think that answers your question. Maybe too much. And then I'm just seeing lots of
worth. I thought it was awesome. That was a great explanation. Right.
And yeah, somebody just said, did these chemicals release from fat during slow weight loss? Yeah, they'll release, period. But rapid weight loss is when we see an increase in the release of these toxins from our adipose tissue. Studies looking at patients who have undergone gastric bypass or lap band surgery have shown like 1,300 plus levels of circulating toxins in their blood post-surgery, because their bodies are just cannibalizing all that fat. That's the whole point of the surgery, right, is to lower that body fat level. And then we often see those patients getting really, really sick after their surgery. And that's probably because they're just absolutely overburdened with these toxins, and their livers are not up to the job.
And I'll chime in to say, I don't know if Tim's having trouble with his audio, but I can always fill the time.
So I'm like the two of us.
But I'll fill in to say, I think this speaks a lot to also weight loss practices and how we address weight loss, how we sort of go at weight loss first, and like how much fat can somebody drop and how can we alter somebody's body composition, specifically reducing their fat, where maybe we might want to rethink it to, okay, it's not about like minimizing their calories specifically or just focusing on exercise, but how can we also reduce potential toxin exposure, help to support detoxification, help to like get their body composition improving before they even start dropping these massive amounts of weight. And so like just like adding more muscle mass to the equation to help to sort of balance out some of the hormonal response too.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I like to phrase it is that I think the magic happens when we're turning the volume down on our exposures to environmental toxicants while turning the volume up on our body's innate capacity to detoxify. And we do that through food, through things like sauna and sweating, you know, getting all of those antioxidants in that you were talking about, Laura, like all of that, like it is very much a dual process. We do these things in concert, and that's really where more of the magic happens, because it doesn't make sense. I mean, I also see a lot of people and practitioners in the health space who love to push, oh, I'm going to just push these liver loving herbs, and they're not stopping to confirm, like, is the person pooping? Because that's like that's the door out, right? And so if we're ramping up all of these compounds through phase 1 or phase 2, and people aren't pooping, like,
or sweating. How many people do you come across that have trouble sweating? And that becomes like, you know, maybe they never were a big sweater, but like as they sort of started accumulating or having issues with whatever chronic issues going on, their sweating is decreased. So now they're not pooping and they're not sweating. So where's it going to go?
Yeah. So it's when we're looking at, you know, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, which is excretion, we have to go backwards through this process to make sure all the doors are open, right? So we start with poop, make sure that's happening, because that's our primary way to get waste out of the body. And if that's not happening, then you're just recirculating those toxins that your liver is working hard to break down. And so let's pay our liver a little respect, and we do that by making sure that we poop.
Absolutely. I think the pooping piece, I just want to kind of like weave in what we talked about earlier about the gut and the microbiome. When there's stagnation in bowel motility, so you're not pooping, it's not moving, or it's the wrong consistency, then that's also going to alter your microbiome. It's going to displace the bacteria from one spot to another, or it's going to create additional fermentation. And all of that is going to then start to disrupt that environment that we're talking about. So you start to see how, yes, the toxin piece that Laura's talking about is like on its own a trigger and has its own complexities and issues, but then starts to impact the systems. And that's where we're talking about that systems-based medicine. Okay, how does this factor have multiple implications that then kind of circle back to what we're talking about tonight about autoimmune disease risk?
Yeah, I like Kathy said, I literally tossed my plastic water bottle and filled up my glass bottle for the family while watching this presentation.
All right.
Excellent. That's the kind of action that I like to see.
That is absolutely the best. It. Yeah, you won tonight's webinar. Congratulations.
Yeah, you won. Yeah. Excellent. Yes. And Ernesto asked, should we completely eliminate plastic water bottles? Yeah, I don't think we need them. There's plenty of stainless steel options in the marketplace that are reusable. Bottled water is not a solution. Bottled water is often just municipal tap water. So you're paying 1900% premium for something that you could otherwise get for free, and bottled water is not necessarily free of the contaminants that we think it is. So, I think there's a lot of things that individuals can do, both from the decreasing toxic exposures to the increasing nutrient consumption and getting the right, figuring out what macronutrients work for you and whether carbs or fat work for you, like all of that. This is a journey. And I feel like when we're working with clients or patients, toxins very often, especially for those on an autoimmune journey. I mean, we already know, and we've already seen people in the comments saying, oh, it took me 8 years to get a diagnosis, right? Like people are already like exhausted by this journey. And what I have found is that toxicity ends up being like one of the last stops on this journey, because everybody's done everything else and they're like, oh, I still can't figure out what's wrong. And then they're like, well, I haven't turned over this stone. Let me see if the solution to my problem lies under there. And my hope is to kind of not be the last stop for people in terms of exploration of this topic, but rather for health professionals to kind of intercede sooner and be like, hey, while we're talking about nutrition and the right nutrients that are right for you, let's also talk about organic. Let's also talk about our cookware and what we cook that food and store that food in. And let's broaden the conversation so that we're not leaving this stone unturned for decades for people.
And I think not to mention how that then feeds into plastic waste that then goes into the soil, that then goes into the water, and then contaminates our seafood and and all our other foods, right? Like it's all of the things. And I think somebody brings up a really great point. What about places like Flint, Michigan, where their municipal water is contaminated? It's not just Flint, actually, sadly. It's across the country where there's water contamination issues, and water is not a luxury. It's something we all have to drink to survive. I'm curious, Laura, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, so the American Society for Civil Engineers, which is the organization that rates our infrastructure, so our city roads and our bridges and our water infrastructure, and they give our water infrastructure like a grade D, and have for many, many, many years. And the water infrastructure that we have, first of all, has long surpassed its useful life. So many of the, your water treatment plant, your water pipes under the city streets, they have a lifespan of, 30 to 40 years. And most of the water systems in the United States have far surpassed their useful life and have not yet been updated. And so what that means is we have this crumbling water infrastructure at the same time that we have more and more chemical contaminants in our water. And so our water municipalities don't often have the capacity to filter out a lot of the contaminants in our water. There are hundreds and hundreds of contaminants. There's only 91 contaminants that the federal government regulates through the Safe Drinking Water Act. And just because a chemical is regulated does not mean that it's not showing up in our water. Millions of Americans, 71 million Americans, I don't remember if that, no, 7 million? 7 million. Americans are drinking water that has actually violated the Safe Drinking Water Act. And so it is a massive problem. And yeah, I agree that water filtration at this point is a necessity, and it should not be, the responsibility to address this problem should not be on the consumer. It should not. And it is. And this is where, again, we have some of those racial and economic disparities. Flint, Michigan is a great example of that. We have communities that have disproportionate exposure through their drinking water, and they live in communities that are impoverished and that don't have water treatment plants that have the funding to take out these chemicals. So it is a massive problem that really, this is where we need like a, FDR style overhaul of our infrastructure. And these things are all possible, but, there's something like over 100 million miles of water distribution pipes in our country. And so updating all of those is a major, major decades-long project. And we don't have anybody who's signing off on that project. So
I love that you said FDR style overhaul. And I would say the water infrastructure and our food supply and the general commoditization of what it is to be healthy, including just clean water and just healthy food. that system needs to be turned on its head.
Yeah, it's enormous. And like I said, people always ask me, what kind of water filter do I recommend? I recommend the one that works to remove the contaminants that you have. The reality is that everybody's water profile is different. The only way you're going to know that for sure is to pay to get it tested. Beyond that, you're looking at, your local water quality report. There's, you can find those online for free. They're not giving you all the information. They're just giving you some information, and some of it's old and whatever, but it's something. And everybody's contamination profile is different, and there's no perfect solution for everybody. A couple people mentioned Berkey. Berkey has some big problems. A couple people mentioned reverse osmosis in the comments. Those are really wasteful. We are living in a place of water scarcity. I heard today on NPR that water experts are hypothesizing that by 2050, 50% of the world's population will not have access to water. Like this is part of where I'm very passionate about this. I get very spicy. I get very fired up. And my hope is
spice on it, actually. So just put more spice on it.
Yeah. I mean, my hope is that translates to people, and people also get fired up and are motivated to take action on an individual level, on a community level, on a citywide level, in a political level, what have you. I don't know. I was literally in my car on the way to the grocery store. I didn't hear the analysis, but I think it's probably due to climate change. Who knows?
It's a climate change issue. Yeah, it's a climate change issue. Yes. And it has to do with, I think, the wells. So we get our water supplies predominantly from these underground reservoirs, essentially.
Aquifers, yeah. And those are drying up. And part of the reason why they're drying up is you've got, large scale agriculture, monocropping agriculture that's pulling that water out and using it for the production for junky processed foods. So lots of interconnected issues here. All of these topics, whether it's nutrition or the soil nutrient depletion, all of these topics are related. And I really think that in the health and wellness space, whether we are here for our own health issues or whether we are here to work with clients or patients, I think this is a big piece of the topic that, we're not going to impart all of this on people that we serve, but if we can just give them snippets and they're motivated to take action, then great.
Yeah, I think finding that piece that you're really passionate about, taking that one step as our friend Kathy did, and she's just like, I am today switching over from plastic to glass. Whatever feels right for you, maybe it's changing your finding new personal care products. Maybe for you, it's getting new cookware. Maybe you're ready for new bedding. Whatever that one thing is for you, just sort of taking it and running with it. And if you are also as spicy as Lara is about what it means to actually have fair access to clean water and clean food, then maybe getting more involved locally and even nationally with various organizations that are working on these projects and talking to your representatives and really voting in the direction that's going to be the most effective in preserving these resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mona just said, it'll be a process. I just moved to grass-fed meat. Great. And it is a process. And I like to share with people, and I'll respond to the Berkey questions because I see a couple of those came up. This is a process. So I like to share with people, I was 7 years into doing this work before I finally replaced my bed. So this is not something that we panic and we go, oh my God. One of the things that I like to remind people, and this I think applies to food as well, unless you have a severe allergy or you're celiac or something like that, is that it's not one time of using a shampoo or drinking unfiltered water that's the problem. It's what we do every day, all day for the long duration of our lives. And so, it's not what we do once in a while that matters. It's really more about what we're doing long term. And so this is a process. It's a journey. If it takes you a year or 2 years or 10 years to kind of work your way through your list of how can I do better? How can I find cleaner? How can I find safer? Then great. You're still moving forward.
And I'd like to add, although I agree with you that avoidance, as you very well stated, is key. Just because it's not always primary, the factors that help you get rid of toxins, stress reduction, improving sleep, sweating, sauna, eating the rainbow, getting good nutrition in general, having good gut health, all those pieces are really powerful tools that work in synergy with avoidance. So if you can't make a big jump and spend a lot of money on maybe like changing all your pots or changing your bedding or whatever it is, know that is part of the solution as well. Supporting the detoxification process is also a powerful step.
Yes, absolutely. And so, yeah, Monica actually just kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of her comment about Berkey. It's not about it being good or bad. It's actually quite nuanced. In some instances, it's good, it's great. In other instances, it's not. So that's an Instagram DM, because otherwise we'll be here all night. And Tim's audio is frozen. I've been texting him. He said his audio is frozen. So Lara, we can do we can wrap up at any time. I feel like we need to do like a Lara dance off stage, but we're not going to do that.
I'm actually already doing a dance. So it's a good thing the camera's off, I guess. I'm
Great.
Like, can you see me?
Great. But yeah, he said that he'll post a little conclusion in the chat once we both wrap up. So we can wrap up whenever we want. Looks like folks want us to keep going, but I have to eat dinner.
I think we have to eventually let you guys go, as fun as a party as this is. I do appreciate you guys, and I do want to also mention, by the way, today is my birthday.
Oh,
so thank you.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was extra special for me to be able to talk about a subject that I love and get to hang out with all y'all and have like the first ever Lara webinar. So
yeah, I feel like we should do another Lara webinar just because.
I'm into it. Let's do it.
Okay, let's do it. I'm like, since we're both IG nerds, we'll do an IG live together. How about that?
I think that is a great way to end this with a thank you so much, guys, for the birthday love.
Look at all, I'm like, what a great, look at all these birthday wishes. Love it.
I know, you guys are the best. Thank you so much. I so appreciate you. And yeah, let's finish this conversation on IG Live. I love that idea.
Yeah, let's do it. We'll schedule it after. We'll connect. And yeah, thank you guys all for being here. This is a great conversation, and I'm grateful for Tim for inviting me and for having the two Laras come on, because I think our presentations really dovetailed and complemented each other, and it really is just a continuum of the same topic. And so thank you guys for being here. Go follow both of us on Instagram, and then you'll be able to catch our continued conversation.
Cheers, everybody.
All right. And then we'll just let Tim say what he's going to say in the comments. Okay.
Yeah, I saw him comment a little bit, so I'm just going to let him end this.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tim.